I stood in front of the hotel mirror in San Diego, running my hands down the front of a plain navy blazer, and I made a choice I had made 100 times before. I took off my dress whites. I folded them with the same precision I would use to fold a flag, and I put on the clothes of an ordinary woman attending her little brother's graduation. Outside the window, the Pacific was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous. And I told myself that today, of all days, I would simply be a sister. 15 hours earlier, in a secure facility 3,000 miles away, I had signed off on an intelligence package that would keep an entire platoon of SEALs alive during the most dangerous phase of training they would ever face. My little brother's platoon. He didn't know that. He would never know that. Not from me. That was not a secret I carried out of shame. It was a secret I carried out of love. And out of 30 years of learning exactly how heavy love can be when the person receiving it refuses to see you as anything but the shape they've already decided you are. My name is Elena Coleman. I am a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, 29 years of service behind me, 51 years old. And in about 4 hours, I was going to watch my father hand a cooler of water bottles to a flag officer and call her the help. I joined the Navy at 22 the year my father told me, without a trace of doubt in his voice, that women didn't have what it took for a real commission and that I'd be lucky to make it through officer candidate school without washing out. I made it through. I made it through intelligence school after that, and then a string of postings that took me to Naples and Bahrain and back to the Pentagon 3 separate times, each time with a little more weight on my shoulder boards and a little more silence at my parents' dinner table, because somewhere around my 10th year of service, I had stopped bringing my career home with me. It was easier that way. It hurt less. My brother Tyler came along when I was 27 and already 3 years into my commission, deployed off the coast of the Horn of Africa when my mother called to tell me she was pregnant again at 44, a surprise nobody in the family quite recovered from. By the time Tyler was old enough to understand what our father valued, I had already become, in his eyes, simply the older sister who lived somewhere far away and called on holidays. He never got the chance to see who I actually was because our father had already decided, and decided loudly, who I was going to be allowed to be. Let me back up further still. Let me tell you how we got here. 3 weeks earlier, the Coleman family backyard in San Antonio smelled like mesquite smoke and cheap beer the way it had smelled every summer of my childhood, and I was standing over a black iron grill in a sundress, flipping ribs I did not want to flip, sweating through fabric that had never once seen a battlefield. My father, Daniel Coleman, Command Sergeant Major, United States Army, retired, sat in his folding chair holding court with 3 men he'd served with in the Gulf in 1991. He had a Lone Star in one hand and the same story he always told in the other, and every few minutes his voice would swing toward me like a spotlight looking for something to expose. She didn't have what it takes for real service, he said, not even lowering his voice, because lowering his voice had never once occurred to him as a possibility. Now she's in D.C. pushing papers. Meanwhile, my son, and here his whole face changed, opened up, lit like a man looking at something he'd built with his own hands. My son is about to be a Navy SEAL. That boy carries my blood. I bit down on the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, an old habit, one I developed somewhere around my second deployment and never managed to lose. These hands, I thought, watching the grease pop and spit off the ribs, these hands signed a classified budget for Special Operations Forces last Tuesday. These hands have briefed 3-star generals. These hands have held the shaking hand of a young intelligence analyst after her first mistake cost lives, and told her how to carry it and how to keep going anyway. Now they were holding tongs. My brother Tyler came out onto the porch in a t-shirt that said Navy across the chest, 24 years old, all shoulders and confident, still 11 days out from graduating basic underwater demolition SEAL training. And my father was on his feet so fast his knees popped audibly. "There he is," Dad announced to the yard, to the neighbors, to God. "The only real warrior in this family." Tyler grinned at me over Dad's shoulder, not unkindly. Tyler had never once been cruel to me, not really. He simply didn't know any better. He'd grown up in the same house I had, drinking from the same well of my father's certainty. And I smiled back and turned another rib. A neighbor, Mrs. Alvarado, wandered over with a paper plate. "Elena, honey, remind me what it is you do up there in Washington? Something with the Navy?" Before I could answer, my father cut in, the way he always did, the way water finds the lowest point in a room. She files, paperwork, make sure the real officers get their coffee. A ripple of laughter went through the yard. Easy, careless, the kind of laughter that cost the people laughing nothing at all. I stood there with the tongs frozen in midair, watching Mrs. Pergram. Alvarado's polite smile faltered just slightly, watching her decide, the way people always decided, that it was easier to laugh along than to ask a second question. I had gotten used to this particular flavor of erasure over the years, not the hot, obvious kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that happens in increments at 100 backyard parties until you almost forget there was ever a version of the story where you got to speak for yourself. I thought not for the first time about the 18-year-old version of me who had once tried to explain to my father over this same grill in this same backyard what officer candidate school had actually required of her, the runs before dawn, the leadership boards, the sheer relentless proving of herself that never seemed to end. He had listened for exactly 40 seconds before changing the subject to Tyler's Little League game. I had learned, that day, the shape of the wall I would spend the next 3 decades living beside. And here is where I want to tell you something, because this is the part of my story people get wrong when they hear it later. I did not stay silent because I was weak. I did not stay silent because some part of me believed what he said. I stayed silent that particular afternoon because I had made a promise to myself a long time ago that I would not turn my father's ignorance into a public spectacle, that I would not win an argument by wielding my rank like a weapon against a 73-year-old man who had spent his whole identity building a story where his daughter was the failure and his son was the hero. But silence has its limits, and that day, mine arrived. I set the tongs down on the side table. I walked over to where my father sat, and I did something I had never done before in 20 years of these exact conversations. I asked everyone within earshot, politely, to give us a minute. "Dad," I said, and I kept my voice level, the same voice I used in briefings where the stakes were measured in human lives, not pride. "I've let this go for years because I love you, and because I decided a long time ago that your approval wasn't something I needed to breed. But I need you to hear me say this clearly, one time. Stop talking about my career like you understand it. You don't. You have no idea what I do, who I answer to, or what I've given up to do it. I'm asking you, respectfully, and for the last time I intend to ask nicely, to stop." The yard had gone quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when it senses a shift in weather. My father looked at me for a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been surprise, might have been the ghost of an apology, and then he laughed. Not cruelly exactly, dismissively. The laugh of a man who has decided a thing is not real simply because he does not wish it to be. "Oh, look at that," he said to his buddies, loud enough for the whole yard. "Little Miss Pentagon's got herself an attitude today." I picked the tongs back up, I went back to the grill, and I understood in that moment something that would matter enormously 3 weeks later, that I had drawn a line clearly in front of witnesses, and that my father had chosen in front of those same witnesses to step right over it. Whatever happened next was no longer a secret I was protecting. It was a consequence he was earning. That night, alone in the guest room of my childhood house, I called my flag aide, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb. "Ma'am, you want me to fly out for the graduation? I can have the itinerary set by morning." "No, Marcus, not this time." I looked at my own reflection in the dark window. "I'm not going to Coronado as an admiral. I'm going as a sister. If I need you, I will call you. But this one, I need to walk into on my own 2 feet. Copy that, ma'am." A pause. "For what it's worth, you don't have to prove anything to anybody down there." "I know," I said, and I meant it, and it was still going to be hard. I lay awake a long time that night listening to the house settle around me the way it had settled around me as a child, every creak and groan familiar. And I thought about a woman I had commanded briefly at 5th Fleet years ago, a lieutenant who'd grown up the daughter of a decorated Marine and had spent her entire childhood chasing a version of pride that never quite arrived. I had told her once, in a counseling session in a cramped shipboard office, that the people who raised us do not get to define the ceiling of what we're allowed to become. I believed it when I said it to her. It had taken me considerably longer to believe it for myself. I thought about the letters again. Actual letters, handwritten the old-fashioned kind, because for the first 10 years of my career, I had believed with the stubborn optimism of a young officer that if I simply explained myself clearly enough in enough detail on paper, my father would eventually understand. I had described promotion ceremonies. I had described the particular quiet pride of commanding a watch floor through a crisis and getting every person home safely. I had described once, carefully, without violating a single classification rule, the broad shape of an operation I had helped plan that likely saved American lives. I never got a reply to any of them, not one. I told myself for years that he simply wasn't a writer, that some men showed love in other ways. It would be a long time before I learned the truer, sadder explanation. 2 nights before we flew out, my father held one of his rituals, a family dinner with all the ceremony of a court proceeding, which, in a way, it always was. Fried chicken, gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in, and Dad at the head of the table with a glass of bourbon he only opened for occasions he considered worthy. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small, worn velvet box. Inside sat his old Army Commendation Medal, the ribbon faded from decades of handling. "Pick it up," he said, sliding it across the table toward my plate. "Feel what real honor weighs, Elena, something a desk officer will never understand." I picked it up. I held the small weight of it in my palm, and I thought about the medals in a vault at the Pentagon, with my name on the citation. Medals my father would never see because they belonged to operations he was not cleared to know existed. And I felt something I had felt many times before at that table. Not shame, and not even anger anymore, but a tired, aching kind of pity for a man who had built his entire sense of self on a story that had stopped being true before I was even 30. My secure phone buzzed in my blazer pocket, the specific rhythm that meant duty, not convenience. "Excuse me," I said, rising. "I need to take this." "Boss, forget where he left his stapler," my father called after me, and Tyler laughed around a mouthful of chicken, and I walked into the hallway and let the tired daughter fall away like a coat slipping off my shoulders. "Coleman," I answered, and my voice had changed entirely, become the instrument it was trained to be. "Ma'am, this is Captain Reyes, 5th Fleet. We have a contact approaching the exclusion zone in the Gulf. Request guidance." "Copy, Captain." I stared at a framed photo of Tyler on the hallway wall, 7 years old, missing his front teeth, grinning like the whole world belonged to him. "You're cleared to engage, understanding rules of engagement if the contact closes inside the zone. That call is yours on scene. You have eyes on the situation. I don't. Keep me posted." Coleman out. I closed the phone and stood in the dark hallway for a moment, feeling the particular vertigo of living 2 entirely different lives inside the same 20 minutes. Then I walked back into the dining room, sat down, and finished my mashed potatoes while my father told a story about a bar fight from 1988. Later, clearing plates, I noticed a Pentagon courier envelope had slipped halfway out of my bag on the counter. My father glanced at it. I saw him glance at it, a small crease of confusion crossing his face before he shook his head and turned away, the way a man turns away from a thought too inconvenient to finish having. Tyler helped me carry my bag out to the car the next morning before the flight and paused with his hand on the trunk. "Hey," he said, more thoughtful than I usually gave him credit for. "You've been quiet the last couple days. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine, Ty," I told him. And it wasn't entirely a lie. I had, after all, made my peace with most of what was coming. "I'm just proud of you. Genuinely, whatever else is going on with this family, I need you to know that part is real." He looked at me for a second like he wanted to ask something further, and then didn't, the way 24-year-olds often don't. Not because they lack the curiosity, but because they haven't yet learned that some questions are gifts you give the people you love. I was grateful, that morning, that he let it go. I would not stay grateful for long. The air at Naval Base Coronado smelled the way it always did. Salt, jet fuel, sunscreen, and something underneath all of it that I can only describe as readiness. Overhead, an MH-60 thudded past in formation, a sound that had lived in my chest since I was 22 years old and had never once stopped feeling like coming home. We flew out commercial, all 4 of us on the same Southwest flight, my father complaining about legroom the entire way, and it struck me, small, useless detail, that this was the first family trip in a decade where nobody's knees had to fold up under a truck's dashboard for 600 miles. Some things, at least, had gotten easier. At the security checkpoint, my father approached with the swagger of a man who believed the entire United States military existed to validate his son. He thrust his ID at the young sailor manning the gate. "I've got the family passes here," he announced, jerking a thumb back at me without so much as turning around. "She's just along to help carry things. Put her wherever the overflow folks sit." The sailor's eyes moved from my father to me, and something in his posture hesitated. Not confusion exactly, more like an instinct he didn't yet have the authority to act on. Before he could speak, a broader figure stepped up beside him, Command Master Chief Elijah Ward, NSW, a man built like a retaining wall, with 26 years in, and the particular stillness of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. Master Chief Ward glanced at the manifest on his tablet. I watched his eyes catch on a line, watched something register behind him. Coleman, Elena. Radom, USN. VIP access, level 1, and watched him look up at me with an expression that asked a question without a single word leaving his mouth. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. A silent stand down, one officer to another, the kind of communication that doesn't require rank to be understood, only experience. Master Chief Ward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd been in the Navy a long time. He knew exactly what he was looking at, and he knew exactly what it meant that I wasn't correcting the record. "Understood, sir," he said to my father, his voice giving away nothing. "Family seating's this way." My father chuckled as we walked. "See that, Elena? Man knows who the real officer in this family is." I said nothing. I watched the Pacific glitter beyond the fence line and thought about something I'd read once, a line from Martin Luther King, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and thought not for the first time. How strange it was that the truest things I knew about justice I had learned inside a family that had never once practiced it toward me. Behind us, Master Chief Ward radioed something quiet into his shoulder mic, a routine-sounding transmission that was, in fact, not routine at all. He had served under 3 different flag officers in his career, and he had learned the hard way that when a senior officer chose invisibility, it was rarely an accident, and it was almost never his place to undo it without asking first. But he had also learned over 26 years that some situations were worth a phone call up the chain, discreetly, out of respect rather than interference. He made that call before we ever reached the auditorium doors. I would not learn about it until much later. Inside the auditorium, my parents were seated in family rows near the front, and I found a seat several rows back among other relatives, not banished to some dusty corner this time. Simply an ordinary seat, in an ordinary section, close enough that my father could still turn around and find me with his eyes whenever the urge struck him. "Sit up straight," he hissed over his shoulder at one point, though I was already sitting up straight. "This is a room for warriors." I said nothing. The admiral in me stayed folded, patient, waiting. During the midday break, my father shoved a blue cooler toward me in the courtyard, ice water sloshing over the rim onto my hands. "Make yourself useful," he said, loud enough that 2 passing officers glanced our way. "Hand these out. At least you can manage that." I picked up the cooler. My hands, the same hands that had signed strike packages and briefed the Secretary of Defense, dripped ice water onto the asphalt as I bent to hand a bottle to an elderly veteran in the shade. A shadow fell across me. I looked up into the face of Captain Nadia Alvarez, crisp in her summer whites. Someone I had not seen in 5 years since Bahrain, since the worst night of both our careers. The night the intelligence had gone dark and I had spent 11 hours in a windowless room finding it again before it cost her battalion their lives. Her eyes went wide. Not the reflex of a salute. I wasn't in uniform and she knew better than to offer one to a woman in civilian clothes, whatever she suspected, but something just as unmistakable. She straightened spine going rigid, voice dropping to something close to disbelief. "Ma'am?" she said, barely above a whisper. "Admiral, is that you?" My father stepped between us before I could answer, all patronizing warmth. "Don't mind her, Captain. That's just my daughter Elena." Family failure. "We bring her along to help with the heavy lifting." He laughed at his own joke. Nadia did not. She looked at him, then at me, and something moved across her face, confusion curdling fast into something closer to fury. When my father wandered off to find someone more impressive to talk to, Nadia followed me behind a stack of equipment crates. "Ma'am, what is happening?" Her voice shook. "Why are you letting him talk to you like that? You saved my entire battalion. We owe you our lives." Because today is for Tyler, I said quietly. And because there are things about the last 30 years that would break something in my father if he knew them all at once, and I have decided, not out of weakness, Nadia, out of choice, that I would rather protect what's left of this family than win an argument with an old man who doesn't understand what he's lost. She looked at me for a long moment, tears standing in her eyes, and did not argue. She understood the particular exhaustion of choosing dignity over vindication because she had watched me choose it once before in a much darker room for much higher stakes. 20 feet away, half hidden by the shadow of a transport truck, Tyler stood frozen, a water bottle forgotten in his hand. He had heard the word admiral. He had heard the word Bahrain. And when I turned, I caught the exact moment the first real question of his life crossed his face. "Elena," he called out, voice cracking. "What did she just call you?" My father appeared instantly, a hand clamping onto Tyler's shoulder. "She didn't say anything, son. Too much, son. Come on, ceremony's starting." Tyler let himself be pulled away, but he looked back at me over his shoulder, and for the first time in 24 years, there was no smugness in it at all. Just the beginning of something unbolting. I stood there a moment longer with the empty cooler at my feet, ice water pooling around my shoes, and let myself feel briefly the full absurdity of the last 30 minutes. A decorated intelligence officer, soaped and sunburned, hauling drinks like hired help, while a woman she had once pulled back from the edge of a career-ending failure looked at her like she'd seen a ghost rise out of the ground. It would have been funny, I thought, if it were also the truest picture of my whole adult life. I picked the cooler back up anyway and finished handing out the water. Because a promise to myself about dignity did not include a loophole for feeling sorry for myself in a parking lot. The graduation hall at Naval Special Warfare Center smelled of floor wax and starch and 200 young men's barely restrained pride. My father made sure I understood exactly where I belonged, a seat near the rear, close to the exit doors, so you don't distract from your brother's moment, though nobody in that room was looking anywhere near me. I leaned back against the cool wall and thought about the 20 years of letters I had sent home from every post I had ever served. Bahrain, Naples, the Pentagon, 3 different aircraft carriers, detailed. Careful letters describing promotions and commands and the small good things that happened in a hard life. My mother had told me once, in a rare unguarded moment, that my father kept them, unopened, in a drawer in his workshop. He had never thrown them away. He had simply refused to let them exist. I closed my eyes for a moment and thought about something my first commanding officer had told me decades ago aboard a ship whose name I still dream about sometimes. That command is not the absence of doubt. It is what you do while carrying the doubt anyway. I had carried a great deal of doubt into that back row. I carried it still. The room went silent as Rear Admiral James Okonkwo Sullivan, commander of Naval Special Warfare, stepped to the podium. His voice didn't need the microphone. It simply used it out of courtesy. "Today we honor 211 men who have earned the right to call themselves Naval Special Warfare Operators," he began. "We honor their grit and their discipline and their refusal to quit when quitting would have been the easier, more human thing to do." He paused, and something in his posture shifted, the way a man's does right before he says something that matters more than the rest of his speech combined. But there is someone in this room today whose name will not appear on any program, and whose work over the last several months quietly kept every single one of these men alive through the most dangerous phase of their training. I don't often get the chance to say this in a room this size. I intend to use it. A murmur moved through the crowd. My father sat up straighter, practically glowing, already composing the story he would tell his old army buddies about the general who'd surely meant him. Admiral Okonkwo Sullivan's eyes moved slowly across the room, not searching randomly but with the particular calm of a man who already knew exactly where he was going to land. His gaze reached the back rows. It stopped on me. I watched something settle into his expression. Not surprise, exactly, more like confirmation of a suspicion he'd been carrying since a phone call from Master Chief Ward 20 minutes earlier. A call I hadn't known about and would only learn of later. My father, following the Admiral's line of sight and utterly misreading it, leaned toward my mother. He's looking at Tyler's row. Probably knows the boy's already a legend. My mother said nothing. I noticed from where I sat that her hands were folded very tightly in her lap and that her eyes had not left me since the Admiral began speaking. My mother had always been quieter than my father in every way except one. She noticed things. She had noticed the Pentagon envelope on the counter 3 weeks earlier and said nothing the way she had said nothing about 100 small inconsistencies over 30 years. Filing each one away in some private ledger she had never once let my father see. I would learn, later that night, exactly how long that ledger had been. He was wrong. He would be wrong for exactly 90 more seconds. Admiral Okonkwo Sullivan stepped away from the podium. He did not walk toward the VIP section. He walked down the center aisle unhurried, his boots striking the polished floor in a steady rhythm that seemed to pull every eye in the building along behind him. As he passed the front row, my father stood, hand already extending. "Admiral, sir." "Daniel Coleman, Tyler's father. It's an honor." The Admiral gave him a brief, courteous nod. "Mr. Coleman." Nothing more. He kept walking. My father's hand hung in the air a half-second too long. His face began, very slowly, to change. 200 heads turned to follow the Admiral's path to the back of the room. He stopped 3 paces in front of me. And then Rear Admiral James Okonkwo Sullivan, one of the most senior Special Operations commanders in the United States Navy, snapped his heels together and rendered a salute so precise it seemed to carry the weight of his entire career behind it. "Rear Admiral Coleman," he said, his voice filling every corner of the hall without needing to rise at all. "It is a distinct honor to have you here today, ma'am. I don't believe most of this room realizes they are in the presence of the officer who personally cleared the intelligence package that got these men through Hell Week without a single casualty." The silence that followed had weight. You could have heard the tide outside. Then, as if a current had passed through the room, 211 newly minted SEALs rose to their feet in a single motion, boots striking the floor like a wave breaking, and their voices rose together in a wall of sound that shook the rafters. "Good morning, Admiral." I watched my father's face travel through an entire lifetime in about 4 seconds, confusion, disbelief, something like vertigo, and then underneath all of it, the specific, pale horror of a man realizing that the story he had told himself for 30 years had just collapsed in front of 200 witnesses. His old veteran's cap slipped from his fingers and hit the floor. He didn't bend to pick it up. I don't think he noticed it had fallen at all. I watched him grasp at the arm of his chair like a man trying to steady himself against a deck that had suddenly begun to pitch beneath him. In 30 years, I had never once seen my father look small. He had built an entire personality around never looking small, around filling every room he entered with enough noise that smallness was never even an option on the table. Watching it happen to him now, in front of 200 strangers, I felt none of the satisfaction I might have predicted. I felt, mostly, the strange grief of watching someone lose an identity, even a false one, even one that had cost me dearly to live beside. Admiral Okonkwo Sullivan turned to him, his voice cooling several degrees. "Mr. But the de Querns, Coleman, I hope you understand the magnitude of the officer standing in front of you. Your daughter is the reason your son is alive to graduate today. I'd encourage you to ask her about her career sometime. I suspect you'll find it considerably more impressive than paperwork." My father sat down heavily, as if his legs had simply stopped being willing to hold him. He put his face in his hands. I stepped out from the shadowed back row. I did not feel triumphant exactly. I felt something quieter and stranger, the sensation of finally standing in the same posture in public that I had carried in private for 30 years. I found Tyler's eyes across the room. He was staring at me with an expression I had never once seen him wear before. Not pride borrowed from our father's approval, but something entirely his own. Awe. And underneath it, guilt. In the chaos of the moment, as officers and family members turned to each other in astonishment, my father, still reeling, still trying to reassemble some version of control, said something he should not have said, loud enough for the row around him to hear. "She cleared the intel for Tyler's op next week," he blurted, grasping for relevance, for a way back into a story where he still mattered. "She knows exactly where Master Chief Ward's head snapped toward him." Admiral Okonkwo Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. I saw it, and my stomach dropped because I understood immediately what my father, in his desperate, thoughtless attempt to reclaim some sliver of the spotlight, had just done. I did not stay for the reception. I walked the edge of Coronado Beach alone as the sun dropped toward the water, my heels sinking into cold sand with every step, the tide dragging at the hem of my slacks. I should have felt vindicated. I had spent 30 years being underestimated by the one man whose approval I had never quite stopped wanting, and today, in front of 200 witnesses, the truth had finally spoken for itself. Instead, I felt hollow. I understood, standing there, that the 3 stars on my future shoulder boards, if the promotion board ever came through, would never undo 3 decades of unopened letters. Vindication and healing, I was learning, were not the same event even when they arrived on the same afternoon. In the parking lot, I found my father sitting alone in the rental car, keys in his lap, not moving. His hands, when I got close enough to see them through the window, were shaking. I knocked gently. He looked up at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face in 51 years. Not anger, not dismissiveness, but something closer to fear. 2 days after we returned to San Antonio, that fear found its consequence. A woman named Diane Okafor called the house. Special Agent, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. My father's offhand comment in a room full of families and future operators. A comment about his son's operational timeline, made in front of strangers, had traveled exactly as far as those things travel in a room full of military professionals. It had reached the wrong ears, or rather, precisely the right ones, the ones whose job it was to notice. Mr. Coleman, Agent Okafor said, seated across from my father at our own kitchen table 3 days later, her tone entirely without malice and entirely without softness. What you said in that auditorium was overheard by several people, including at least one individual whose loyalties we can't verify. It forced Naval Special Warfare to alter a piece of your son's deployment plan on short notice. That's not a punishment I'm here to hand out. It's a fact I need you to sit with. My father's face had gone the color of old paper. I wasn't thinking, I understand, Agent Okafor said, not unkindly. That's usually how it happens. You're not being charged with anything, Mr. Coleman, but you are going to complete a formal operational security briefing and you are going to sign an acknowledgement that you understand the rules going forward. Because the next time, and I mean this as plainly as I can, there may not be a next time where the only consequence is embarrassment. He signed the papers with a hand that hadn't fully stopped shaking since the beach parking lot. Agent Okafor lingered a moment after gathering her folder and looked at me with something like professional sympathy, the particular look one career officer gives another when they both spent years cleaning up the collateral damage of good intentions gone careless. For what it's worth, ma'am, this happens more than people think. Pride makes people careless in rooms that can't afford carelessness. I'm glad it was caught before it became something worse. So am I said and meant it more than she probably realized. Because the alternative, my brother's safety compromised by my father's need to matter in a room, was not a version of this story I would have survived easily. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters more than the reveal, more than the salute, more than any of it. My father's humiliation did not heal our family. It was necessary. It made real, external, unavoidable something that had been true and invisible for 30 years. But it was not the medicine. The medicine came later, slower, and it came at a price he had to pay himself in installments over months. That night in San Antonio, the cicadas were loud enough to drown out almost anything, which was probably why my father chose it to finally say the things he'd been circling for 3 weeks. He came out onto the back porch with a bottle of the good bourbon, the kind he only opened for weddings and funerals, and 2 glasses. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just poured. I spent a long time telling myself you were a disappointment, Elena, he finally said, his voice low and rough in a way I'd never heard it. I needed you to be one. If you weren't, then I had to look at everything I assumed about what makes a person worth being proud of, and I wasn't ready to do that. So I built you into a failure with my own 2 hands, because it was easier than admitting I'd been wrong my whole life. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded yellow clipping, a small item from a military newspaper 5 years old, a brief public mention of a commendation for an officer whose name, in an early print run before redaction, had accidentally included mine. I saw this, he said. 5 years ago, I saw your name on a list of people the Navy was proud of. And I tore it up and threw it in the trash can in the garage, and I sat out there and drank until I could make myself stop thinking about it. Because if you were that good, then I'd spent half my life being wrong about my own daughter, and I didn't know how to carry that. You burned the letters too, I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, and something in his face cracked open. Everyone, 20 years of them. I told myself I'd read them eventually, and then I never did, because I think some part of me always knew what they'd say, and I wasn't ready to know it. I sat with that for a long moment, the anger I had carried for so long, the disciplined, useful anger that had gotten me through academy hazing and deployment losses, and every insult he'd ever handed me across a dinner table didn't disappear. But it made room, finally, for something quieter. I didn't need you to see the Admiral, Dad, I said. I needed you to see me. Just your daughter. That's all I ever wanted from you, and it's the one thing you decided 30 years ago that you weren't going to give me. He put his head down on the table and wept. Not the performative grief of a man caught, but the real, racking kind. The kind that comes out of a person only once or twice in a lifetime. I let him. I didn't rush to comfort him. I had learned over 3 decades of command that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for someone's pain is let it finish arriving before you try to fix it. I keep thinking about Tyler's face, he said finally, wiping at his eyes with the back of a rough hand. The way he looked at you after the salute, like he was seeing something for the first time. And then, I think, how many other times did he look at you and not see it? Because I trained him not to look. I did that, Elena. Not just to you, to him too. I taught my own son to see his sister as less than she was, and I don't know how a man comes back from something like that. You start, I said, by not looking away from it, which is what you're doing right now, so that's something. He let out a rough, broken sound that was almost a laugh, some pep talk. I never said it would feel good, I told him. I said it would be true. When he finally looked up, I said the thing I had decided, somewhere over the Pacific 2 days earlier, that I needed to say clearly so there could be no confusion about it later. I forgive you, I told him. I mean that, but forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, and it isn't a blank check either. If you ever again talk about my career, or Tyler's, as if you understand something you don't, if you ever put either of us at risk the way you did in that auditorium, I won't be back. That's not a threat, Dad. That's a boundary. I should have said it years ago, and I'm setting it now. He nodded, and for the first time in my life, I watched my father accept a limit without arguing with it. My mother had been standing in the doorway longer than either of us realized. When she stepped out onto the porch, her voice was steadier than I had heard it in 25 years. I let you talk to her like that for 2 decades, Daniel, Patricia Coleman said. I told myself keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the family together. It wasn't. It never was. That's on me too. And I'm done pretending it isn't. My father looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them that had probably needed to pass between them for a very long time. The following Sunday, the kitchen smelled like coffee and bacon in a way it hadn't in years. My father was at the table with the newspaper, and when I walked in, he did something he had never once done in 51 years. He stood, pulled out the chair beside him, and said, "Good morning, Elena. Coffee's hot, made it the way you like it." There was no barb hidden in it, no performance for an audience, just an old man trying, clumsily, sincerely, to build a new habit out of the wreckage of an old one. We went to church that morning, and when the pastor recognized Tyler's graduation, my father stood on his own, unprompted, and said, in a voice that carried to the back pew, "I'm proud of my son. And I want this congregation to know my daughter is a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, and she has been carrying this family's honor a lot longer than I ever gave her credit for. I was wrong about her for 30 years. I'm not going to be wrong about her for one more day. I won't pretend that a single church announcement undid 3 decades. It didn't. But it was a start, and starts matter more than people give them credit for. That afternoon, I found him in the garage, the same garage where he'd burned my letters, building a small oak display case with hands that were finally steady again. "I want people to see it when they come by," he said, sanding a corner smooth. "Not because I need to brag, because I hid your light for 30 years, and I don't get those years back, but I can stop hiding it starting today." At the airport, my father's hug was different from any hug he had given me before. Not the brief, obligatory contact of a man performing fatherhood, but something that actually meant to hold on. "Go on back to Washington and do your job," he said into my ear, his voice rough. "Just know your father's here in San Antonio, and he's proud of you. Actually proud, not the kind I made up for people at parties." I'll hold you to that, Dad, I said, and I meant it as both affection and boundary, the way most of the truest things in families end up being both at once. On the flight back, I thought about Tyler, who had called me the night before, voice still uncertain in a way that suited him. I didn't know, he'd said, any of it. I'm sorry I laughed along with him all those years. You didn't know because I chose not to tell you, I said. That was my call to make, and I made it because I wanted you to have a childhood where your sister was just your sister, not a rank. I don't regret that. I do regret that Dad turned my silence into a weapon against me instead of just leaving it as a gift I was giving this family. Those are two different things, Tyler. Don't confuse them. He was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, I think you're the toughest person I know, tougher than any Bud-S instructor I had. That means more than you know, I told him, and I let myself believe it because it was true. Weeks later, I stood at a podium at the Naval Academy, invited to speak to a room of midshipmen about leadership, about the parts of service nobody puts on recruiting posters. I didn't open with a list of accomplishments. I opened with the truth. For most of my career, I told them, I was very good at being underestimated. I want to tell you that this was a strength, and in some ways it was. It taught me patience. It taught me to let my work speak instead of my rank. It taught me that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. But I also want to tell you something that took me 30 years and one very public reckoning to learn. Quiet dignity is not the same thing as silent suffering. And there is no honor in letting people you love mistake your patience for permission. I looked out at 200 young faces, most of them still deciding who they wanted to become. It is not the critic who counts, I said, borrowing words that have outlived every person who ever needed them. It is not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the one who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again. Because there is no effort without error. Set your own boundaries early. Do not wait 30 years, the way I did, to tell the people you love the truth about how their words land. Boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are, very often, the only proof that the love was ever real to begin with. Afterward, I announced the creation of a small scholarship fund, the Quiet Command Fellowship, named not after myself, but after my mother, the woman who had spent 25 years learning far too slowly that keeping a family's peace and keeping a family's silence are not the same act of love. I called my father from the flight line a month later, standing on the deck of a ship in the Pacific, the sun dropping into the water in long orange sheets. Just wanted to hear your voice, I told him, and it was, for the first time in my adult life, entirely true. Not an obligation, not a test, not an old wound checking whether it still hurt. Just a daughter calling her father because she wanted to. I'm glad you did, he said. And then quieter, I read all your letters, Elena, the old ones I could find. Took me a week. I should have read them 30 years ago. You're reading them now, I said. That still counts for something. There was one, he went on, and I could hear him working to keep his voice steady, from Bahrain. You wrote about a night watch that went wrong, and how scared you were, and how you did your job anyway because people were counting on you. I read that one 3 times. I kept thinking about all the nights I sat in that house telling people you didn't have what it takes. I was wrong about the bravest one of my kids the whole time, and I had the proof sitting in a drawer for 20 years and refused to open it. You're opening it now, I said again gently, because some truths need repeating before they can be believed. That's the only part I can ask of you, Dad, not to undo it, just to keep opening it. I can do that, he said. I'm going to keep doing that. The wind picked up off the water, carrying the smell of salt and diesel and the particular readiness of a ship about to move. I touched the cold weight of the stars on my shoulder, not because I needed them to prove anything anymore, but because they were mine, earned quietly over 3 decades, by a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for the space she took up in the world. If there is a lesson in any of this, and I think there is, though I resisted saying so for a long time, because lessons handed out too easily tend to cheapen the cost of learning them, it is this: your worth was never up for negotiation, not with your father, not with anyone. Quiet dignity is a real thing, and it is worth protecting, but dignity without a boundary is just a longer kind of silence. The truth does not need you to shout it, but it does need you, eventually, to say it out loud, to the people who most need to hear it. even when, especially when, your voice shakes the first time you try. I stood on that deck a long time, watching the horizon go dark, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged. Not because anyone had finally saluted me, because I had finally fully saluted myself. There is an epilogue to this story, small and unremarkable in the way that the truest endings usually are. 6 months later, Tyler deployed for the first time as a full member of his platoon, and this time, when he called home the night before, my father didn't call me to ask what he was allowed to know. He simply told Tyler he was proud of him and told him to come home safe and left it at that, the way a father is supposed to, without needing the moment to be about anything other than his son. I flew to San Antonio the following Christmas, my first in that house in almost a decade. My father had, in fact, finished the O-case in the garage. My dress uniform hung inside it now, beside my grandfather's old service ribbons from Korea. 2 generations of a family service displayed side by side for the first time in the house's history, neither one positioned above the other. Patricia, my mother, had started keeping her own ledger of a different kind that year, a small notebook where she wrote down, she told me privately, one thing she was proud of about each of her children every week, whether or not she ever said it out loud. "I'm making up for lost time," she said, a little embarrassed to be caught with it. "It's not much, but it's mine, and I'm not asking permission for it anymore." On my last night home, my father and I sat on the same porch. No bourbon this time. Just 2 months of coffee going cold in the winter air, and he asked me hesitantly, the way a man asks a question he's been building up the courage to ask for a long time, what it was actually like, my work, my career, the parts I'd never gotten to tell him because he'd never once asked. So I told him, not everything, some of it will never leave the rooms it happened in, and he understood that without needing it explained, but enough. Enough for him to finally know his daughter, the real one, not the story he'd invented to make his own disappointments easier to carry. 29 years, he said when I finished, shaking his head slowly. And I spent most of them not even looking at you. You're looking now, I said. I am, he said. I'm not planning on stopping. Some walls take 30 years to build. It turns out if both people are finally willing, they don't take nearly that long to start coming down, not all at once. Not perfectly, but stone by stone, porch conversation by porch conversation, one honest sentence at a time. That I have come to believe is the only kind of reconciliation worth having, not the kind that arrives in a single blinding moment of revelation, but the kind that has to be chosen again and again quietly, on ordinary nights long after the salutes have faded and the room has gone back to being just a family sitting together, finally telling each other the truth.